First, I just want to say I've missed you guys. Been gone a couple weeks, been in different parts, but a couple weeks ago I was up with the Salvation Army up in the north part of Michigan. It's just a powerful time. I can talk more about it when I'm in smaller circles, but last day I hadn't even started to speak yet, and somebody got up to testify, then they testified again and again and again. It went a long time, and then suddenly it's like the Spirit took the service over, and people got up and started coming to the altar, and they gathered around, started praying, and then they got from all over the place. In fact, there was no altar. This was a ballroom in a conference hotel, and it was just people creating a sacred space where they could meet God. And it was just powerful, you guys. I wish you could have been there. So I drove away from that. I went back to the cottage so I could work on something else. And while I was there, Sunday rolled around, and then you were there. Because I was sitting in a $99 chair rocker watching Ethan preach 2 weeks ago. And he hit one in the upper deck. And when that sermon was over, I'm looking on the screen and I'm just watching this outpouring of people from College Church, just moved by the word of the Lord that day. Watching you come forward and kneel in the front and kneel around. It felt like I had been to revival twice in 3 or 4 days. My goodness. I had tears in my eyes. I was just amazed. So I am thrilled. My soul was refreshed. Are you all right? Well, good. So because I was gone, I got you something. All right. I open it myself. I've been thinking a lot about you guys at College Church, watching you guys, and trying to figure out, what do they need? What can I afford? And I was looking all over for what I thought would be the perfect gift. And I got to tell you, I think I got it right, but I'm a little nervous. So be nice. If you don't like it, pretend like you do. I'm excited. Yeah? Are you nervous? Me too. Are you ready? Now, some of you are looking like Scrooge, but others, you're thinking, baby, it is Christmas. See, I've been watching you, and I figured you could use one of those things. Now, for some, it's like the gift you didn't want. But when somebody gives it to you, you're like, oh, thanks. Try to be nice about it. But you're really thinking, some of you are thinking, well, I already have one of those. You probably don't. What you have is leisure, and leisure not Sabbath. It's just a day off. And others of you are thinking, I don't really know what I would do with that. It comes unassembled, and it seems like a lot of work. Some years ago, my dad got me, true story, a case of motor oil at Christmas. And it seemed an awful lot like, I said, Dad, why didn't you just give me an oil change? This just looks like too much work. Friend of mine, he's in our church. I'm looking to see if he's here. Good, he's not. Talk about him. He got his wife an ab blaster. Couldn't understand why she was upset. Somebody had to tell him, when you give your wife an ab blaster, you are making implications about her figure, which not promising, and you're just giving her more work to do. It's like giving her a dumbbell set and say, go for it. It's not going to work well. Others of you are feeling, and probably more of you, are feeling like, well, I mean, I would do that, but I'd pay for it later on. So you're not really giving me a gift, you're giving me a payment that I'm going to have to get back some other time. Am I getting closer? So when you tell someone like you and like me who are driven to achievement, who love to get stuff done, and the bigger and more outrageous, the better, when you tell us that we need to take a Sabbath, don't be offended if we're not overwhelmed by that. It feels like another rule, feels like an implication on our schedule. Here, you're a workaholic. You need a Sabbath, and we will get defensive. And when I ask, why do I need a Sabbath? And then you give me the Sunday school answer, which is because God rested on the seventh day. I say, yeah, but he never told you to. Until the Exodus. He never told you to until the Exodus. When God created the world in 6 days, he pulled back, and the communion of three, not the solitude of one. It would be like Americans to say, this is me time. It was within the communion of three that God withdrew, savored what he had done, and enjoyed himself in his own community. And his soul, we hear in Exodus 31, was replenished. A good translation of that is, he was resouled. The word there for replenished is nephesh. It means soul. When God breathed into us, we became a living nephesh. And so when God took a Sabbath, his soul came alive again. Time became as sacred as things. But he never told you to. He hinted in Genesis 49, said it was coming, but he never told you to rest. But in the Exodus, things began to change. And that's when the lights came on, you guys. I started thinking, I've been underestimating this thing that we call Sabbath. In fact, I've been mispracticing this thing that we call Sabbath because I've not attached it to the Exodus. You can't really understand Sabbath until you understand the Exodus. If you take the Exodus out of the Sabbath, all you have is a day off. So I brought the board out so I could draw pictures. That'd be all right? Oh, good. 3 of you are in a good mood. What we said a few weeks ago was that the story of the Exodus is not just a moment in history, it's a paradigm of life. It's a way of understanding our own lives. When we understand what is happening in the story of the Exodus, we see ourselves somewhere in that story. In Exodus, the problem is not really sin, properly so called. The problem is really bondage, which means that salvation in Exodus is not so much about forgiveness, it's more about freedom. So the story of the Exodus is a story of God taking people who were in bondage and bringing them to a place of freedom. Now you can see why we are, each one of us, somewhere in the story of Exodus. We are somewhere, all of us, on this continuum between a life of bondage and a life of freedom. Now, each one of these have a person in particular who captures the culture of bondage or the culture of freedom. And in Exodus, the person who captures bondage is the Pharaoh, and the person who captures freedom is Yahweh. Blessed be his name. And so the Exodus is a journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. In Egypt, or the Promised Land, Pharaoh or Yahweh is not just a person. It is a person, but it's not just a person. It's also a culture. It's a complex web of values and rituals and practices in our lives that either resemble a life of bondage or they resemble a life of freedom. If we were to get more specific about the two cultures and say, define it, please, so I know where I am on the continuum, we would say something like this, and we said it a couple of weeks ago. One is a culture of anxiety. The other is a culture of Sabbath. One is a culture of scarcity, and the kingdom of God is a culture of abundance. One is a culture of fear, where people dread their enemies and avoid them. The other is a culture of hospitality, where people open their lives and their borders because we too were once slaves in Egypt. One is a culture of despair, where something is always wrong or about to go wrong. And the other is a culture of hope. It's a culture of optimism, where something has been promised and God will come through. One of these is a culture of protest. It's a culture of independence, which is just get me out of here. But the other is a culture of mutual submission. When you put it like this, you start seeing the whole thing as a series of continuums. And all of a sudden, what you thought was easy in life becomes pretty difficult. It becomes clear after a while when you look at it that one of these is the culture of holiness and the other one is the culture of unholiness. And the question isn't so much, are you sanctified or are you holy? The question is, which way are you leaning? Which way are you moving? Because if this is holiness, then the way into it is not simply by making a choice. One doesn't just say, I'm going to have this kind of a life and then believe that they have it. This isn't just a decision. This is a habit. It's a bunch of decisions that are stacked on top of one another and that lead us to a life of freedom. So it's not so much a question of, have I had a sanctifying moment, though I think there is a moment. The question is, am I in the gravitational pull of Egypt or bondage, or am I in the gravitational pull of the Promised Land and freedom? When a rocket takes off of the earth, it uses powerful engines as thrusters to push itself off of the earth because gravity is always pulling it down again. But as it continues and as it gets closer to the planet, to where it is going, it enters the gravitational pull of that planet. Now all of a sudden, it's not pushing off as hard anymore. It's being naturally pulled into the planet where it's going. So the question is not really where on the continuum are you? The question is, are you in the gravitational pull of Egypt or in the pull of the kingdom of God? There's a lot of people who consider themselves holy just because they want to be. And while the want is amazing, you certainly can't move without it. Not enough. It must be followed by unlearning Egypt and learning the promised land. We must learn how to trust someone we barely know. We must learn the difference between desires and true desires. And we must learn how to educate true desires until they become the driving force in our lives, and it just pulls us into the life of freedom. Otherwise, we're working way too hard at this. All right. Pause for a moment. You all right? Where are you? I guess. What happens in holiness churches is we look at this and we go, yeah, I see what I'm supposed to be, so yeah, I am. And it becomes hard for us to admit places where these words are not true of us. Or else we become fatalistic and we just go, well, yeah, I guess we're all this way. And so we're just the healthiest patient in the intensive care unit. There's more to it than that. What is the way in? One wonders, at least I do, if anxiety is more than just a word. It's actually a heading for a life of bondage. And one wonders if Sabbath is not just a day. It's a habit that opens the door to freedom. It's not just one of the 10 commandments. It's the way into all commandments. I wonder. Now that you put Sabbath in Exodus, the first time we're told to do it, Exodus chapter 16, where they run out of food, there is none. It's nighttime, tomorrow's coming, and it's the 7th day. And we have for 6 days been anxious about where we're going to get our food. And just when we learned how to work hard, here comes the Sabbath, and there's nothing on the ground. When you see Sabbath put into that context, you start to think, wait a minute, God is up to something. And then he says, on that day, you are to pause, stop, cease, rest. The second time it occurs is in the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. And in the Ten Commandments, it becomes this day at the end of the week that somehow separates the people of God for the things of God from the rest of their lives. Today, I want to compare two other places. One is a brickyard, and the other is a festival. Egypt was one of the most advanced cultures in its day. Back in the day, it was a first world in an ancient civilization. Egypt was known around the world for its advances in science, its cutting-edge technology, its towering economy, its impressive buildings, and there is probably no building that Egypt is more famous for than pyramids. Still one of the seven wonders of the world. But pyramids require bricks, and bricks require brickyards where you make them. Most of the brickyards in the day were not in the middle of cities with civilization. They were usually out in more remote areas like Siberia, where the public almost never went. And so they were filled with people that worked and overworked. Many of them were Hebrews, because Egyptians in the day were averse to hard labor. Can't blame them. Don't feel sorry for the 18-year-old Hebrew who just got out of high school and didn't really want to go to college. If he was willing to work in a brickyard, he could get a good life for himself. Keep in mind that brickyards were not invented as concentration camps to incarcerate Jews. They were needed as part of the industry of building pyramids, which go back far before the Jews. So an 18-year-old high schooler not really interested in college could get a pretty good job in a brickyard, and if he was willing to work hard, do a little overtime, well, all right, a lot of overtime, and he saved his money, why, he could make quite a living. He could take his kids and put them to college. If you can get your kids in college, they don't have to work in your brickyard anymore. No. They could get a degree and become a manager of another brickyard. That would be amazing. Can you imagine having a conversation with your friends talking about your kids? Saying, well, how did your kids? Oh, my kids, they went to school, they got a degree, put it on an eagle wall, and now he's over running a brickyard somewhere in a remote area. Nobody in my family's ever done it. Maybe they could become an advisor. They could become a site director, really good at this. Oh, they could make quite a living. And if they did everything right, they could build even bigger barns and someday say to themselves, I have plenty stored up for many. That's like a 401k back in those days. Take it easy, rest, drink, be merry, which sounds an awful lot like a Sabbath. You see, brickyards come at a cost. You lose your soul in them. You lose your calling. You experience transport your identity to some cause or some mission that is not even you. So when you retreat, you don't even know who you are. If you put people who work in a brickyard into one room, you know what you would see? You would see a bunch of people that were addicted to accomplishments, achievements. Everything they do is about the bottom line and results. You would see people that were always performing, always being measured by their peers or by their perceived audience. You would see people that were hyper competitive, those that were always comparing themselves to somebody else's work or status or symbols or place on the org chart, and never really happy with what they have. You would see people addicted to growth. And growth, the Pharaoh knows, is always more. It's bigger, smarter, stronger, better looking, more appealing. Brickyard is where souls go to die. And by now it should be clear to everyone in the room that the brickyard is not really a place at all. It's a state of mind. It's a way of thinking about your work that traps you in a golden cage. And if the brickyard is a state of mind, then the solution is not really a new job. Because you never leave the brickyard, you take it with you. It's up here. No, you need something else besides better working conditions. You need to find your soul. Now, you can see why people who work in good organizations that mean well, like churches, can lose their souls. And why, when Yahweh hands us a gift, he's all excited about it. And why, when we open it, we are truly underwhelmed. A day off, I'll pay for that later. If you really want to wow me, just give me an 8th day. In the Sabbath, which rises in the Exodus, 2 things are happening. One is God is putting a fence in between his people and Egypt. And on that fence, he is saying, no. He's trying to keep us from going back to the anxiety, scarcity, fear, despair, and protest that we are too fond of. This is natural for too many of us. On that day, a 24-hour period, we refuse to do what Pharaoh calls us to do. So the first part of the Sabbath is an act of resistance to the culture, the anxiety, the scarcity, the competition, the one-upmanship that is rife in the culture of Egypt. To do this, you have to find your Pharaoh and stick it to him. You have to find that place in your life that is the source of all pressure. Not all of your job drives you crazy. Just some of it does. Find the place in your work that is creating for you the most pressure, the most soul-crushing weight. And in that 24 hours, you ardently refuse to participate in anything resembling that activity. It's an act of resistance. It's a line in the sand. It's a way of saying, we will not be owned. So for me, most of my life is lived in the crucible of an audience and a deadline. Somebody is always waiting, something is always due, and then it's overdue. And so all of my life is either lived in preparing something or leading something or presenting something. So for me, Sabbath means nothing involving deadlines. Nothing in preparation for meetings, which is a good part of my life, or audiences. No performance. Nothing necessary in those 24 hours. So on the first level, it's simply a way of saying, I am going to create a space in my crowded life for God to find me. You still there? Which leads to the second part of it. The second part of the Sabbath is an act of renewal. And this, I fear, is the part we never get to, which is why in Exodus chapter 31, the Sabbath is presented in ways that for the first time appear. It's the first time in the 6 references to Sabbath that are in Exodus, or the other 6 in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, 12 overall. It's the first time that we are told Sabbath is a sign. And we know that signs are never things you look at. They're things you look through to see other bigger things. This is what's wrong with people who fill the Sabbath with a bunch of rules. They're missing the reality of it. The Sabbath occurs to us as a portal into a world where we are headed, that is a world of abundance and hospitality and optimism and mutual submission. And we will never see it if we don't create for ourselves the margin to see it. But just because we have the margin does not mean we are engaged in activities that are in fact replenishing the soul. I've been in rooms with ministers and multiple times in the last 6 months. And each time I'm in a room with ministers today, we are asked to describe to one another what the state of our soul is. And the words that I hear from ministers, self-included, to describe us is words like tired, frazzled, chaotic, confused, numb, thin. And aside from the fact that I'm thinking, oh boy, God help us, these are the shepherds. The sheep must be dying. What occurs to me is almost every one of us have a day off. So can you explain to me how it is that a group of people, leaders who regularly have a day off, consistently report conditions that are like the conditions a Sabbath should be solving? All I can conclude is that every Sabbath might be a day off, but not every day off is a Sabbath. No, it doesn't become a Sabbath until it is made holy to the Lord. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 14 for the scorekeepers. It is not a day to ourselves. It's not an hour of me time. It is a day that we consecrate to the Lord our God. That's what makes it holy. So we who are full of days off, who have rested our bodies, consistently report tired souls. How do we structure that day? I can only give a few ideas. These are just, last thing I want to do is become a Pharisee and say, oh, here's how you do it. Some old guy that, I think there's a few components that we could use at the start of that 24 hours that would frame that day as holy time. And that is time that is spent with God Himself. A day off is when you get up, have coffee, eat an English muffin, and then go off to other chores around the house that you don't like to do. A Sabbath is when you find Yahweh at the beginning of your day. The first component might involve worship. For some of you, that's going to be a centering prayer like the one Jordan led us through a few minutes ago. For others, in my case, it's walking around in the dark, reciting, sometimes out loud, verses that I've memorized. For others, it's putting on music. I've done that. We listen to the music as it washes over us. And we think to ourselves, my goodness, what if it's true? What if it's true that I am the child of Yahweh? And I can hear echoes from the promised land coming back. That is followed by a time of meditation. For me, at least, it's the scripture is open. I've learned early that because I'm what they used to call ADD, if I don't put something in front of my eyes quickly, my mind will run off to 100 other things. Is that just me? Oh, good. I have to put the word in front of my eyes quickly to give me something. This is the agenda that I have to think about. And I'm learning, you guys, still learning to read it in a way where I listen for a voice. I'm not looking for thoughts. I'm not looking for something to preach. I'm listening for a voice. I remember a professor who would ask us to read the Bible in front of him, and while we read it, he would just, smart people always do. What do you see? Smile. Is that all? You mean there's more? Keep reading. Do you see it? You see it? You see it? And his eyes are wide, like any minute now he's going to run into it. I'm learning to read the scripture like that, listening for the voice of God, seeing him across from that little table saying, what do you see? Do you see it yet? Yep. Oh, wait, do you see it? Do you see it? Like I'm going to run into it. I'll let it distill, whirl in my mind for a while. I will try to put words to it. It occurred to me one day that when God spoke to me, he almost never used English. In fact, he almost never uses words. Words are what I use to articulate what I believe I hear God saying. The word of the Lord becomes my fumbled attempt at trying to articulate, put language to what I think God is saying. And this can take a long time, so you might be journaling and scratching stuff off, but sooner or later, You'll get down to it. It will rise and it will be short. And then you can go into a period of prayer. Where you articulate back to God what you thought you heard him say. And pause. And ask him to clarify. The Puritans used to say we take in through reading, we digest through meditation, we let out through prayer. All we're doing here is trying to bring a little structure, not the only structure, just one way of doing it. And what we're trying to do is to make the day something that is bigger than a day off. Because the weariness of the American soul right now cannot be solved by throwing more days off at it. You may need a day off. That's true. But my hunch is you desperately need a Sabbath.